welcome. I am Jody Elowitz. I'm the Director of Education and Engagement for the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, and I'm here to welcome you tonight on behalf of our organization and the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. Tonight we are in the third part of our lecture series about understanding the Holocaust, and we have a very interesting topic tonight, which is Nuremberg laws and the impact on the American legal system. We have two wonderful gentlemen who will be on this evening and discussing this particular topic. Tonight our lecturer is Kenneth Ledford, who is the assistant professor and chair of Department of History at Case Western Reserve University. And then Mark B. Cole, who you might remember from the last two lectures, who is the associate professor of history from Cleveland State. They can give you a little bit more information on their background, but I, of course, want to, let them have the floor so that they can discuss the topic in depth and have room for questions. So tonight, if you do have any questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will moderate those questions and either answer them as we go or we'll answer them at the end of the talk. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark.
All right, thank you, Jody. It's great to be here again. I am representing Cleveland State, but also I'm, as many of you know, I'm the executive director of the Ohio Council on Holocaust and Genocide Education. So I'm wearing that hat this evening, and I'm very happy to have my Cleveland colleague, Ken Ledford here, who is not only an associate professor of history and law, but he is also chair of the department. Are you still chair?
I am.
I don't know if that's fortunately or unfortunately.
All condolences are welcome.
But I don't want to say any more. I'd like to let you get right on with it. And I think you have the ability to share your screen already.
Indeed. Let me. Whoops. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the three sponsoring groups and Jody and Mark and Emma Snape from the Maltz Museum for inviting me to participate in this program. I suspect that several of you here are people I may have met before in similar forums. And I also rather assume a substantial amount of knowledge on the part of all of you about the Nuremberg laws themselves. But I want to approach them tonight from a slightly different angle that's based on some relatively new scholarship that I'm not sure that all of you may have been as fully exposed to. And I do want to encourage you to pose your questions in the chat. Mark and Jody are going to curate them. And if it's appropriate for them to interrupt me, I want to encourage them to do that. But I also want to finish pretty quickly and leave lots of time for your questions, because I hope that what I'm going to talk about will provoke a lot of questions. In August of 2015, I was getting ready for classes to start, and I received an email from a friend and colleague of mine, Jim Whitman. His full name is James Q. Whitman, and he's a professor at Yale Law School. Jim had written an article manuscript and asked me to review it for him because he feared that being entirely in a school of law, he might not have kept up with some of the historiography and wanted me sort of to vet it for that. Now, I've known Jim for a long time. We met in 1985 in the Lower Saxon State and University Library in Göttingen, the old library. There's a new one there since, when we were both doing our dissertation research. And the title of his article was The American Influence on Nazi Race Law. Now, this was a long manuscript, for he intended it to be a law review article, which, as many of you know, are often 75, 85, even 100 pages set in type. So it was a daunting piece of work. This is Jim, who is trained both as a lawyer and a historian. He wrote, his first book was a very good book on a debate about Roman law in Germany in the 1830s. Now, Jim had this piece, and I read it, and I thought it was really good. And I encouraged him to pursue it. His editor at Princeton University Press, with whom he had published a number of books, persuaded him to change it from a long article into a short book so that he could reach an audience that doesn't read the Stanford Law Journal and that sort of stuff. That was in August of 2015. The election campaign of 2016 intervened, in which, as we all remember, issues of immigration, citizenship, and race became central part of the discussion. And then in August of 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville added anti-Semitism to the mix of burbling items from the past, as the Tiki Torch marchers chanted, "The Jews will not replace us." So Jim's book was not written in response to the campaign of Donald Trump for president or the Unite the Right rally. But when it appeared on September 4th, 2018, it really spoke to the moment. And he published it as Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. It is a slim book. It warrants a careful read. It's a close read. It's a very well told story. And it's available in an affordable paperback from Princeton University Press, which is not always the pricing strategy of Princeton University Press. Now, working from sources that were actually pretty well known, Jim in this book overturned a previously prevailing consensus that American race laws, particularly the public accommodation segregation laws of the Jim Crow era, had not held much attraction for the Nazis as they drafted their race laws, for their goal was not to cordon Jews off into a separate subset of society, but to eliminate them from German state and society altogether. Other scholarship had already drawn attention to parallels between American thought and law and Nazi German thought and law regarding eugenics and involuntary sterilization. I'm thinking here particularly of Stefan Kühl's book from the early 1990s, and I'm going to bracket that. I'm going to look at what Jim looked at. But what Jim argued from what he found, hiding in plain sight, was that for the Nazis, the model was not just a racist Jim Crow American South with its public accommodation segregation laws, but a racist America writ large. Now, I grew up in North Carolina in the 1950s and 60s, and I remember public accommodation segregation. This is an example of that. The Nazis were not averse to this. This is a sign from occupied Poland prohibiting Jews from entering the parking lot, both in German and in Polish. But that's not what Jim's book is about. And he argues, I think very persuasively, that prior historians who had looked to the Nazis drawing inspiration from public accommodation segregation had failed to find it. He argued they were looking in the wrong place. Jim drew attention to two aspects of American law in the 20s and 30s that the Nazis investigated and researched as models for their own legislative efforts to exclude Jews from German state and society, culminating in the two Nuremberg laws of September 1935. First was citizenship law, with its corollaries of immigration and right of residence. One doesn't necessarily have to be a citizen in order to be resident someplace. And second was anti-miscegenation laws, laws prohibiting the marriage of or sexual contact between persons of defined groups that are defined as different. Now, what I propose to do in about the next 20 minutes is to look a little bit about what the context of Jews in Germany was as the Nazis developed their thoughts about race law, what Jim argues was the influence of American race law on the drafting of the Nuremberg laws and other Nazi race law, and third, and this will continue into the questions, I'm sure, what does this interconnection of American race law embedded deep in our past with Nazi race law portend or suggest for contemporary debates in the United States about critical race theory, immigration law, citizenship law, and even teaching the history of the American past? So that's all by way of confession of where we're going to go. And I hope that you are in agreement to go there with me. Now, at the end of the First World War, Weimar Germany lost a substantial amount of territory. They lost Alsace and Lorraine in the West, which had been incorporated into the Reich in 1871. And they lost West Prussia and Posen in the East, which had been part of the Kingdom of Prussia most of the time since 1795. The German population in the last pre-war census was of 1910 was just under 65 million. And the next census in 1919 was 61 million. The territorial reduction caused a loss of some 6.5 to 7 million inhabitants, and just over 2 million Germans died during the war. But because of the territorial loss, obviously there was some natural increase in there as well, and there was in-migration. This is a map of Germany in the borders of 1919 after the Treaty of Versailles. This is West Prussia, this is Posen, this is Alsace and Lorraine. But look closely at this, well, we'll get there in just a minute. Now, Jewish citizens were fewer than 1% of the German population in 1933, and their percentage was declining. There were, on January 1st of 1933, before the Nazis came to power, there were about 523,000 Jewish citizens out of 67 million Germans. And by June of that year, in the next census, that number had shrunk to 505,000. The Nazi rise to power caused some German Jews to emigrate. Now, excuse me, these are not citizens, these are residents. Of the 523,000, 400,000 were German citizens, but there were significant numbers of foreign Jewish refugees resident in Germany. Most of them in 1933 had been fleeing anti-Semitism in interwar Poland, the state that was reestablished in 1919 after having disappeared in 1795. There were 90,000 foreign Jews living in Germany in 1914, many of whom were Russian, fleeing pogroms in Imperial Russia. There were 108,000 by 1925. But in the period 1914 to 21, a total of 105,000 had entered, many more than the 18,000 total growth, and many had left. They had passed through Germany, often with the exclusion of some of the Jewish, with the encouragement of some of the elite German Jews. For many German Jews were well assimilated and were concerned that these Eastern Jews, the Ostjuden, would upset a tenuous balance of assimilation and welcome in German society. Now, German Jews, despite assimilation, had remained discriminated against until the end of the empire in 1918. But the openness of the new republic to advancement by Jews led to friction between traditionalists and those more open to advancement. This map is important to look at. this is a map of the German Empire, and the darker spots are the places with a higher percentage of Jews in the population. And you will see that, and this is a long historical reality, there were lots of Jews in Alsace. Even today in France, there is a concentration of Jewish population in Alsace. Some of these Jews emigrated from Alsace into Weimar Germany after Alsace and Lorraine were annexed by France. Similarly, here in parts of West Prussia, but mostly in Posen, you had significant percentages. Now, these aren't high. The darkest is 6% of the population. This is not Poland. There are no majority areas. But obviously, many of these Jews emigrated into Germany because of the anti-Semitic policies of the interwar Polish government. Jews were almost unanimously German patriots. More than 100,000 Jews served in the German army in the First World War, and 12,000 Jewish soldiers fell on the field of honor for the fatherland. And this is a defensive sort of poster. Anti-Semites in the German army had, and on the German right during the war, had argued that Jews were shirking their duty. They actually conducted a count of how many Jews had served in the army, and then they buried it because it turned out that the thesis that they had shirked their duty and had not served at the front or died was wrong. Jews disproportionately served and disproportionately died. Jews lived primarily, some 60 or 70%, in large cities. In pre-war Germany, Berlin was the largest with 160,000. Prague and Vienna become important by the 1930s, of course, because both of them by 1939 are incorporated into Nazi Germany. This shows the absolute and relative growth of the total German population, the Jewish population. And you can see that the Jewish population was declining as a percentage of the population, not dramatically, but it certainly wasn't growing. And much of this was because Jews who came to Germany to escape pogroms, most of them got on boats and came to the United States and to Latin America. This shows the European Jewish population in 1933, this great map from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. The great bulk of European Jews lived in Poland and the Soviet Union, all in territories where there are massive refugee crises today and will continue to be massive crises. And these were some significant percentages. This is a map showing the Jewish population density in the Pale of Settlement around 1900. And you can see that here in Poland and here in Belarus, and the southern part of this is in Ukraine, Jews reached 17% of the total population. It was against this background of refugees coming from the East, from the unrest of the Civil War after the Bolshevik Revolution, fleeing from anti-Semitic pogroms in an independent Ukraine between 1917 and 1922, that the Nazi Party came into being, and in January of 1920 formulated its 25-point program. Now, this called, like many Germans did, for the annulment of the Treaty of Versailles, like many on the right, for the withdrawal of German citizenship from Jews, and for a racialist notion of belonging in the German national community, and that this should be strengthened. This is a flyer. I think I said January. It's actually February of 1920. But the translation is important. From the beginning of the Nazi Party, the call was that only members of the nation may be citizens, and only those of German blood can be members of the nation. Accordingly, no Jew may be a member of the nation. QED, no Jew may be a citizen. Non-citizens could live in Germany only as guests and must be subject to laws for aliens. The right to vote should be enjoyed by citizens only. All official appointments, government positions should be held only by citizens. And if the state cannot support its entire population, foreign nationals, non-citizens, and all Jews, even those who had lived in Germany for centuries, are defined as non-citizens, would have to be deported. And all non-German in-migration had to be prevented, and that all non-Germans who had entered Germany after the outbreak of the war had to leave Germany forthwith. Within this utopia of citizens only, the citizens should have equal rights and duties. This was the platform. It waxed and waned in its centrality in the history of the National Socialist Party over the 1920s. But keep it in your mind as we turn to January 30th of 1933, when the Nazis came to power in a presidential cabinet appointed by Hindenburg, with Hitler as the chancellor on that day. Legislation to implement Nazi policy began pretty quickly. February 27th, the Reichstag burned, and the next day, the already drafted decree for the protection of people and state was enacted by presidential decree, abolishing basic political rights. The Communist Party delegation was expelled from the Reichstag, and this set the stage for the Nazis to seize power. The New York Times covered this. All red newspapers barred. They didn't sound too broken up about that. Now, the first legal measure after the Reichstag fire was the enabling law, which was essentially a constitutional amendment and passed the Reichstag by a 2/3 majority only by expelling the communists and intimidating all other parties except the socialists to vote for it. And it gave the chancellor the right to enact laws without the consent of the Reichstag for a period of 4 years. So decrees by the chancellor became ipso facto law. And it was on this basis that all subsequent legislation to exclude Jews was passed. This is the law for the protection of the people and state, the law to lift the need of the people and state. And the first set of anti-Jewish decrees came down in early April 1933. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service excluded Jews from the civil service, which was many jobs, all school teachers, all railroad workers, all letter carriers, unless they themselves were veterans of the war who had served at the front, or unless their fathers had been veterans and had died at the front. That's known as the Hindenburg exception. President Hindenburg insisted on that. The same day, Jews were excluded from admission to the bar, a profession into which Jews had flocked. I've written a book about this. On April 22nd, a decree regarding physician services with a national health system excluded them from the medical profession. And on April 25th, the law against overcrowding of German schools and universities excluded Jews from admission to higher education, something Jews had pursued with great enthusiasm. And these are the proclamations of these laws in the Reichsgesetzblatt, publication of which makes them official. This is the final act of legislation becoming effective. Now, hearkening back to the party program of 1920, The Nazi government set to work in 1933 drafting a law to revoke the citizenship of Jews and others, mostly leftist politicians, who had been naturalized during the Weimar Republic or who had emigrated. And on July 14th, 1933, they enacted the law for the revocation of naturalization and withdrawal of German citizenship. It permitted repeal of undesirable naturalizations between the revolution in 1918 and the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, and the revocation of citizenship of Germans who had gone abroad and who opposed the regime merely by publishing their name. And it immediately repealed the naturalization of 16,000 Jews who had fled from the East during Weimar and who had become German citizens. These were mostly Poles. They had given up their Polish citizenship by becoming naturalized. Now they lost their German citizenship and they had no citizenship. They were literally stateless. Many of you may know that at the same time, following American mandatory sterilization laws, the Nazis also enacted the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases. So this is the law of the revocation of naturalization. And this is the first list of persons whose citizenship was revoked. Many of these are not Jews. You'll see Heinrich Mann here, Thomas Mann's brother, the novelist Heinrich Mann, Philipp Scheidemann, the socialist politician who had been chancellor, as well as the authors Ernst Toller, a playwright, and Kurt Tucholsky. A former socialist politician, Otto Wels, is here. It's interesting to read these lists. On June 5th, 1934, a meeting was held in the Justice Ministry to prepare anti-Jewish legislation. It was chaired by the Minister of Justice, Franz Gürtner, this guy, who was a moderate in the meeting. An expert and the chief draftsman of the Nuremberg laws was another lawyer, Bernhard Lösener, who teamed with Gürtner to be moderates in the debate because the radicals were represented by the convinced Nazi Roland Freisler, who was later president of the People's Court, who wanted the most radical possible outcome. The key memorandum to prepare for this meeting was drafted by Heinrich Krieger, a young German lawyer employed in the Ministry of Justice who had studied in 1933-34 for 2 semesters as an exchange student at the University of Arkansas Law School, where he had learned about segregation laws, about American citizenship law, and about anti-miscegenation laws. And indeed, he had written an article that was published in the George Washington Law Review in 1935 called Principles of the Indian Law, which dealt with the then American law that provided that Indians did not have the right to vote. This was something that was popular in many of the Western states in the United States with large Native American populations. He came back and in 1936 published a book, Das Rassenrecht in den Vereinigten Staaten, Race Law in the United States. So he was the expert. And the document that Jim uses in his book is the detailed transcript of this meeting, which shows the Nazis' fascination with and dependence upon American citizenship and anti-miscegenation laws. They discussed Krieger's memorandum and repeated to American models. And the most radical Nazis were the most ardent champions of the lessons that the American approaches held for Germany. Segregation was not central to the program, but they were interested in citizenship and sex and reproduction. Hitler in Mein Kampf had admired American race-based immigration law, particularly the highly restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, which limited immigration with an overall cap. And what immigration was permitted was based on quotas, based on the country of origin of Americans in the 1890 census. There had been 3 subsequent censuses, but they went back to the 1890 data, because this discriminated against those who had immigrated mostly since 1890, Southern and Eastern Europeans, including large numbers of Jews and Catholics. Japanese were entirely excluded by the Immigration Act of 1924, and Chinese had already been excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The focus of the Immigration Act was to promote immigration to the United States by Nordics, people from Norway, not from S-hole countries, and this was its intention. Hitler also admired the de facto and de jure second-class citizens for Blacks, as well as Filipinos and Puerto Ricans who had been added to the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Now, the history of American citizenship and immigration law is something we can't go into for a long time here, but the very first act in 1790 limited naturalization to any alien who is a free white person. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited Chinese from emigrating and ever becoming citizens. And there actually is a substantial 19th century Supreme Court jurisprudence as to whether, being non-citizens, they had any rights under the 14th Amendment. In 1917, this was expanded by the Asiatic Barred Zone Act to exclude the emigration of others from Asia. And not to be outdone, a special provision also excluded, quote, homosexuals, idiots, and anarchists. And then, of course, the Immigration Act of 1924. None of this, all of this remained in effect until it was undone by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which remains the regnant basic rule in the United States. Second-class citizenship for Black Americans was imposed mostly in the American South, but also elsewhere because of some of the Jim Crow voting laws. But Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and Native Americans all suffered under forms of residency that did not give them political rights of citizens. And then, of course, Chinese were excluded. This is a German poster describing Black and white in America, legal limitations on the rights of Black people. The dark Black is no right to vote, and the prohibition of marriage with whites, as well as segregation. The double crosshatch are prohibition of marriage and racial segregation. Others included prohibition of marriage, racial segregation in schools, and only those white states, proudly, including Ohio, did not have anti-miscegenation laws. So if citizenship was the first focus, sex and reproduction in the form of anti-miscegenation laws, prohibition of marriages between Blacks and whites was important. This is a map showing the green states in which interracial marriages were always legal, the sort of yellow or tan states where prohibitions were repealed before 1888, but the dark states never repealed their legislative prohibitions. It was overturned as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the case of Loving versus Virginia in 1967. So these Nuremberg laws introduced in September 1935 were primarily two. The Reich citizenship law, which limited citizenship to those of German or kindred blood and attempted to define it, and the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which prohibited both intermarriage and extramarital sexual intercourse between Jews and those of German or kindred blood. There were supplementary laws, including the one in November of 1935, which defined a Jew as being someone with 3 Jewish grandparents, regardless of religious observance. There had been much discussion at the meeting about whether to adopt the American one-drop rule, that 1 drop of Black blood, any sign of Black heritage, Black ancestry, defined one as Black. Only the strictest Nazis thought that was acceptable. Most of the Nazis believed that was too harsh. Germans with 2 Jewish grandparents would be defined as a Jew if that person was either religiously observant or married to a Jewish person. So you can see that the racial notion of this is nonsense from the beginning. And then there were various categories of mixed race people, Mischlinge, with different heritages. And the Hindenburg exception for those who had fought in the war or whose fathers had died in the war was finally dropped. And again, these were published in the Reichs Gesetzblatt, and this is the definitive legal commentary on these 2 laws published in 1936. So these are posters that were published, and you've seen these sorts of things explaining the ancestry that it took to be counted as a Jew. This was taught in schools. And again, there continued to be implementing regulations through the Reichskristallnacht all the way to the outbreak of the war. Now, before we go to questions, I want to sort of sum up. What Jim's work shows is that racialist thinking was expressed in law and policy not only in the Nazi Nuremberg laws of 1935, but it was throughout the West. The United States was no exception. Second, it shows that the National Socialist state was open to international models for its legislation, both racial and otherwise. These were not stupid people. These were highly educated lawyers, and one of the great tragedies of the Third Reich was the important role that highly educated lawyers played, and this plays out in the judge's trial at Nuremberg as well. Third, there were conscious parallels not only in legal draftsmanship, but also in historical analogies. In their discussions, the Nazis always talked about US policies of the extermination of Native Americans. The Trail of Tears always showed up. And of course, famously, Hitler drew parallels to the Turkish genocide of the Armenians. Who today remembers the Armenians? What I think Jim's book is useful in helping us provide context for the Nuremberg laws is in the context of some contemporary debate in the United States, in Germany, and throughout Europe. Public discourse and political rhetoric in the United States, Germany, and throughout Europe shows the persistence of racialist thinking. And that provides a temptation to demagogic politicians to instrumentalize race simply to advance their quest for power. And particularly when coupled with legislative efforts to distort the teaching of history, to prohibit calling what's going on in Ukraine war, is a very dangerous development. And third, this thinking in the 1920s arose out of an acute refugee crisis in Eastern and Central Europe. And we're facing another one today. And we're going to be facing this, I think, for an extended period of time. And policies of authoritarian states like Poland and Hungary, which so far are working better, and we can talk about why Poland is open to Ukrainians and Hungary less so, but other policies of those two authoritarian states, both of which are being investigated by the EU to have their votes suspended and their participation in EU budgets suspended because of their anti-democratic authoritarian legislation. All of this increases the urgency of understanding this history. I broke my promise. I went 40 minutes instead of 35, but let's have more of a conversation now.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions rolling in. Ken, in our last series, we talked about a little bit about American eugenic laws, and we've got a question. Would you please comment upon the influence of Sir Francis Galton in American eugenic laws? I mentioned that the Americans were pioneers in American race science, and Cold Harbor Springs, New York was sort of the epicenter of it. And could you say something about that, please?
Yes, it was absolutely acute. Stefan Kuhl published his master's thesis from Johns Hopkins, I want to say in 1994. It's K-U umlaut H-L, S-T-E-F-A-N. I forget the title of the book now, but he treats it completely, yes. Galton was lionized by eugenicists in the United States. Madison Grant's book of 1915, The Passing of a Great Race, was a massive hit. Kuhl writes about that. My colleagues at Case Western Reserve, Renee Sentiel and Peter Schulman, who are US historians, have a course that they teach undergraduates called Books as Bombs, books that had a massive impact in American thought. And they have their students read Madison Grant. And all of these eugenics thinkers, and Mark has talked about Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and that whole enterprise funded by the Rockefellers. All of this credited Galton, who of course invented the word eugenic. It was an international movement. Indeed, if you want to look at an example of it, the terms of the Rhodes Trust that Cecil Rhodes set up to provide scholarships for young men, they since have broadened this, so it's men and women, to study at Oxford, was Anglo-Saxonism, which is part of this eugenic thought, because it was open to young men from the United States, from the white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and from Germany. One of my former colleagues, Elizabeth Kohl, who now heads the Asian Studies program at Notre Dame, did her PhD at Oxford in Chinese history as a Rhodes Scholar. This united the West.
One of the things that I did in the chat is I put a link to one of my former colleagues. She's no longer here at CSU, but Stephanie Hinnerschitz wrote a book called A Different Shade of Justice, which talks about, in contrast to the Loving case, name versus name, which was argued amongst the Asian American community. So this issue of Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese being treated similarly under Jim Crow in the South, but also in the North, is kind of a very interesting one. And I'm glad you brought that up. I was also glad to see you spend some time talking about those population differences, the declining Jewish population, because Also, in a previous iteration, we talked about how in the anti-Semitic imagination or the Nazi imagination, Jews were everywhere, under every rock, and sort of this growing menacing force. But the reality was they were actually a tiny proportion of the population, less than 1%, and declining. And so going against the demographic trends that many Nazi racial hygienists were purporting at the time. It looks like, go ahead.
I'll take on the anonymous attendee. I think there is no comparison whatsoever between the way Jews were treated by the Nazis and the way that public health measures, vaccine mandates and passports and the like have been proclaimed. It's a tendentious and disrespectful comparison, in my view. There's been a long history of resistance to public health measures. There was resistance to inoculation with cowpox with Edwin Jenner. There's actually a very good book about vaccine resistance in Germany, published by Vandenhoek and Ruprecht out of Göttingen. But the vaccine passport has nothing to do with the Nuremberg Code. It is a legitimate exercise of public health, which is a game of statistics. There are rare adverse events. If you look at the number, it is very, very small. And the danger of the virus was very, very high. This is, I think, a complete misuse of the comparison, and any politician who advances this should be avoided.
So another question has come in about connections to, I'm sort of scrolling to it, because you mentioned critical race theory in your introduction. And of course, this is of central importance to Ohio educators now. Do you want to comment in any way on, you are associated with actually law, and critical race theory grew out of law, and many people think that it's taught everywhere and by everyone.
Correct.
And I would be the first to say that I guarantee that most university faculty probably don't know the first thing about critical race theory.
Yeah. Actually, I do know a substantial amount about critical race theory. My research does not use it. I've written a book about Prussian lawyers in private practice in the Second Empire and Weimar Republic, and I'm writing a book right now on the Prussian judiciary in the Second Empire. Race, if you will, fits into this to some extent because there are groups of Poles, groups of Danes, groups of French, as well as Jews who somehow got viewed as a separate race. But critical race theory doesn't apply to that. Critical race theory is something that I've actually criticized as being more of an observation than a theory in law school. It is the observation that ostensibly race-neutral norms and rules, when applied in the context of the inequalities of American society, have consciously chosen racial outcomes. And I think that's undeniable. As I said, I was born in Mississippi and grew up in North Carolina. And you do not leave the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ostensibly ended the Jim Crow era that started anywhere from 1885 to 1900. You do not leave that behind in a half a century. I am completely persuaded that embedded in principles of tort law, principles of contract law, that the inequalities consciously created in American polity and society are embedded and persist. The mere fact that we can cherry pick quotations from Martin Luther King and personally shake hands with people of different races and not call them offensive words, that does not erase the embeddedness of race in our legal system. This is purely a law-related theory. It might show up in history courses at the university, it might show up in some political science courses, but it's mostly a professional school enterprise. And as the media again and again and again report, and teachers say, it doesn't show up in public school curricula at all. It is just way over the heads of K through 6 and even middle school and high school students.
Any other questions that folks would like to pose for Ken or I?
I want to second Anita Devine's embrace of the guarded gate. It's good both on eugenics, but particularly on citizenship law. Daniel Okrent's book. I actually got into American citizenship law by reading and reviewing a lot of books about German citizenship law, of which there was an efflorescence in the 90s and early 2000s as Germany changed its citizenship law in 2005 to make the first significant revisions since the imperial and state citizenship law of 1913. Maybe someday we can talk about citizenship law in another lecture.
Well, to that point, I found it interesting when you talked about the revocation of citizenship, in particular of Eastern European and Polish Jews, creating this population of some 16,000 who found themselves stateless with nowhere to go because the Germans didn't want them, the Poles wouldn't let them in. And immediately, I was just a few weeks ago in my Holocaust class, we talked about, well, in 1938, they created crisis, which is going to lead to an important assassination. I don't know if you want to talk about that since we've got a few minutes left.
Well, but that was exactly the right. When Herschel Greenspan assassinated the German official in Paris, it was because his parents, who were Polish Jewish refugees, had fled to Germany from pogroms and anti-Semitic policies in Poland, had their Polish citizenship rejected, but had their German citizenship and residency rejected, and had been expelled to sort of a no man's land between the two borders. And we're living this November. They were out in the rain and beginning snow without any shelter. And in his anger, he was moved to direct action. Now, I'm not, Anita, I'm not sure what cancel culture means. It's a slogan that I hear from certain corners of the political spectrum in the United States. It is something that you can get stories about in the popular press about. There was one in the Times this week about a student who is afraid to speak her mind for fear that her colleagues criticize her. I don't experience, and I've taught at Case Western Reserve for 31 years.
So we got another one from Marilyn Yeager. He said, you mentioned the 2016 presidential election. Can you expand on this? Everybody wants to bring this forward.
Yeah, I mean, well, we're going to see it. You, like I, are bombarded, if we do watch television, with ads, and J.D. Vance has a new one. Building a wall at the border to stop immigration. Not of Norwegians, but of people whose skin hue is substantially darker than that of Norwegian bachelor farmers, was a central slogan all through the primary campaign of one party and all through the main presidential campaign. And then it became policy. It was policy that was reasonably consistently overturned by courts because of inartful drafting. Remember the Muslim ban. I mean, that was in February of 2017. Now, gerrymandering and voter suppression are simply the return of the repressed. These are practices that for good reason were outlawed in 1965, and for no reason, without any consistent study of history, the majority opinion in Shelby County in 2013 said there's no reason, history has changed, there's no reason to think these things will be done again. They are being done again, and they have been done again beginning immediately after Shelby County in 2013.
We got another question from Rachel Chance, who says, do you know if Russia has laws similar to Nuremberg? I'm not certain if, Rachel, if you mean right now or in Soviet times they had any sort of racial laws. I guess I could let Ken interpret that for himself. I'm fairly certain the answer is no in both of those contexts, but.
Yeah, I really have no idea what the current state of citizenship law and naturalization law might be in Russia. Clearly, with respect to Ukrainians, what Putin is claiming now is sort of a 19th century pan-Slavist notion that Russians and Ukrainians are identical, and that Ukrainians just speak really bad Russian. And both in the empire and through the Soviet Union, there was cyclicality of policy between Ukrainianization, having indigenous people from the region whose first language was Ukrainian run things and have the primary say, and Russianization, prohibiting the teaching of Ukrainian and the use of Ukrainian as the language of instruction in schools and that sort of thing. So it's very complicated. And Ukraine is very complicated because from 1772 until 1917, it was the western part of Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had a radically different history than the part of Ukraine that was in the Russian Empire. And the borders changed radically both between 1917 and 22, and again from 1939 to 45.
Rachel, one thing I would add, I do know that Afro-Ukrainians are quite worried at this sort of Russification talk, this attempt to sort of eradicate Ukrainian culture and identity and create a what might be what we might think of as a white Russia. I do know that that is happening. So at least some people, minorities, are worried that are currently in Ukraine, and they're not certain what the future would hold. Jody has appeared, and that must mean we're out of time.
You have 1 minute left. If there is one more question or if there's one more point that needs to be made, I leave it to you to make it.
I see you've already done my job for me and posted that our next lecture is on Tuesday, April 12th. Marty Kalb from the OCHGE, my organization, is going to be talking about degenerate art. So you are all welcome to come to that event. Please sign up early and often, as they say.
And thank you to you both. It was an incredibly interesting talk, Ken, and I think it brought up a lot of questions. And part of our jobs is also to help people make a connection to today's world. And I think certainly this conversation absolutely did that. So thank you to all of you for joining this evening. We appreciate you coming out on Zoom. And thank you to Ken and Mark. And hopefully we'll see you on April 12th. So thank you again. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I enjoyed it. Good night.
Bye-bye.